No one in the village could remember the exact moment when things began to feel off. There was no marked day, no single event large enough for someone to point to and say that this was when the world stopped being what it was. There was only a vague sensation like stepping outside in the morning and realizing the air was slightly colder than it should be, even though the season itself insisted that everything was normal. Winter always came. That alone never surprised anyone. It arrived regularly and predictably, like a promise kept across generations. The people of this land had learned long ago how to live with it. They knew how to store what was needed, when to move, and when to remain still. This knowledge was never written down. It lived in routines, in practiced movements of hands and bodies, and in stories shared beside the fire. Winter was not an enemy. It was simply part of the order of things. But that year, the order developed small abrasions. At first, they were details difficult to name. Snow arrived a few days earlier than usual, then melted faster than expected. The wind was not stronger, but it lingered as if it had forgotten when it was supposed to stop. Familiar roads remained where they had always been. Rivers froze on schedule. Yet time itself felt less precise. The markers people relied on to structure their lives no longer aligned perfectly with what stood before them. No one said this aloud. To speak would have given it weight, and weight demanded meaning. Meaning demanded responsibility for unease. It was easier to treat the year as slightly unusual, a minor deviation not worth dwelling on. Seasons always passed. They always had. Work continued. People did what they had always done with the same inherited caution. Storage was checked. Journeys were calculated. Days of staying in were accepted as necessary. From the outside, nothing suggested a community facing anything abnormal. That normalcy made the misalignment harder to tolerate, like a faint vibration in the ear that only the one hearing it could feel. Sometimes, someone lingered longer than usual over a small task. A gaze rested on the sky a moment too long. A pause stretched slightly past comfort during familiar gatherings. These signs were not enough to become stories, but they accumulated quietly as a thin layer of alertness within each person. Not fear, attention. Nature did not appear hostile. It did not rage punish or deliver clear warnings. That indifference unsettled people most. Without a force to oppose, there was no clear response. No one to blame, no action to resist. Only the sense that familiar rules were operating just a little differently, and no one was sure they had the right to demand they return to what they had been. Some believed it was simply fatigue. A long season made the mind more sensitive. When people lived long enough, in cold and silence, they began to notice what they once ignored. From that perspective, the change was not in the world, but in themselves. And if that were true, the solution was patience. Bodies would adapt, minds would steady. Others, though they did not say it aloud, began to feel that familiarity itself was slipping away. Not because of a single dramatic shift, but because of small deviations that repeated. When something is always only slightly off, it creates a pressure difficult to name, yet impossible to ignore. Like walking on a road that tilts just enough that every step requires correction, even though the eye insists everything is level. In the long evenings when work was finished, and there was nothing left to do but wait, the feeling became clearer. Not a fear with a shape, but a question not yet asked. A question about whether the structures people relied on to understand the world were still as solid as they believed. The question did not demand an answer. Its presence alone made the space feel tighter. No one thought this was the beginning of something larger. That idea, if it surfaced at all, was dismissed as unnecessary exaggeration. The world had always produced strange years, and people had survived them. The history of this community was built on that belief. Hardship was absorbed into daily life, folded into shared memory, and ceased to disturb. And so that winter continued as though there was nothing worth remembering. Snow fell. Wind moved through the land. People carried on with their work. Only one thing changed quietly and without ceremony. Not the sky, not the ground, but the way people listened to their own sensations. A new attentiveness, unformed and unnamed, began to grow within them, like a question not yet clear enough to speak, but already too present to ignore. The sense of misalignment did not disappear once people became aware of it, but it also did not grow in a way that forced anyone to stop or change the course of their lives. It remained there quietly like background noise that people learn to ignore. And when a feeling cannot be erased, the easiest way to keep living is to convince oneself that it does not matter. Denial began from very reasonable places. This world had never been perfectly stable, and people here knew that better than anyone. They had lived through harsher years, longer seasons, periods when everything seemed close to breaking. Compared to those memories, the current unease was far too faint to be treated as a warning. It caused no pain, did not interrupt work, and did not demand immediate action. At times, someone noticed that they were thinking more than usual about the weather, about time, about details that normally required no attention. But those thoughts arrived at inconvenient moments, when hands were cold, when tasks were unfinished, when the day was not yet over. They were pushed aside, not because they were wrong, but because they arrived at the wrong time. There would be time to think later when things were clearer. Each person saw only a very small part of the whole. One noticed that the snowfall was uneven. Another felt that nights seemed longer in thought. Someone else sensed fatigue arriving earlier, even though work had not increased. But taken separately, none of these details was enough to form a troubling story. They resembled minor deviations that everyone experienced from time to time, then forgot once a new day began. When these sensations were shared, they were usually softened immediately, not because the listener disbelieved them, but because familiar explanations were already available. Fatigue, weather, age, memory. These explanations were not created to conceal the truth, but to keep life from being interrupted by questions that had no answers yet. No one in this community believed themselves to have a complete understanding. They were deeply aware of their own limits, and that awareness made them cautious. Concluding a single fragment of information was considered more reckless than waiting. Under ordinary circumstances, such caution was a necessary virtue. It kept people from overreacting to insignificant fluctuations, and so denial did not unfold as a collective decision, but as an unspoken agreement. No one claimed that everything was certainly fine, yet everyone acted as though there was no reason to think otherwise. Work continued, plans were maintained. Days of staying still were accepted as part of the season. From the outside, there were no signs that fear was taking shape. That silent consensus provided temporary safety. When everyone around you continued as normal, it became difficult to believe that anything was wrong. If fear were real, surely it would have been clearer. Surely it would have forced someone to speak, but no one did, and that silence came to be understood as evidence. Over time, the small changes stopped being noticed as changes at all. They became part of a new routine, absorbed into daily rhythm. People adjusted without realizing that they were adjusting. They grew accustomed to being slightly colder, slightly more tired, slightly quieter. There was no moment clear enough to mark that this was when everything became different. The danger of denial did not lie in its being false, but in how effective it was. It allowed people to keep living, keep working, keep believing that the world still operated within familiar limits. For a while, that belief truly stabilized them. No one panicked. No one disrupted the fragile order they depended on. But each time a sense of unease surfaced and was pushed aside, it did not vanish completely. It left behind a faint trace like a scratch, not deep enough to hurt, but deep enough to accumulate. These traces were not consciously remembered, but they existed layering over one another, quietly reshaping how people responded to the world around them. At that point, no one believed denial was a problem. It was seen as a sign of reason and experience. Perhaps in that moment, they were not wrong, but the question remained unspoken whether denial was merely a reasonable choice or something deeper, a reflex that allowed people to keep moving forward when stopping to face fear directly might have made it impossible to move at all. Silence did not fall over the community like a curtain. It seeped in slowly, almost invisibly, through very small choices that each person considered reasonable. After a period of rational denial, words became more economical, not because there was nothing left to say, but because some things once spoken would force people to face the sensation steadily growing in their chests. And so they chose not to speak. No one proposed this. There was no meeting, no public agreement. But during brief encounters, familiar conversations began to drift away from sensitive points. A sentence ended earlier than usual. A harmless remark replaced a thought. The avoidance was gentle enough to produce no resistance. Everyone did it, and because of that, it quickly became the new norm. Silence in this form functioned as a social mechanism. It kept the surface of daily life smooth and undisturbed. When no one raised an issue, the issue seemed not yet large enough to exist. If it did not exist, it did not require action. And without the need for action, people could continue doing what they had always done at the same rhythm that had carried them through previous seasons. But within the space left by words, people began to notice one another more closely, not with suspicion, but with a new kind of attention, quiet and difficult to explain. They registered very small changes that once would have meant nothing. One person walked more slowly when going outside. Another avoided eye contact a moment longer than usual before turning away. Someone paused with a hand on the threshold, as if weighing something that could not be spoken. Taken individually, these details held no meaning, but repetition made them memorable. People did not conclude. They noted them. Each observation was kept private, not shared, not tested. And so no single fragment ever grew large enough to become a shared story. There was only the sense that someone else was also watching, also remaining silent, also waiting for something more defined. In conversation, unease was pushed outward by attaching it to the external world. People spoke about the weather, about fatigue, about the small practical matters of life. These topics were safe because they required no admission. It was easier to speak of the cold than of unrest, easier to speak of an unpredictable year than of a fear without a name. This silence did not separate people in an obvious way. They remained close shared space and continued the familiar rituals of community. But beneath that ordinary activity, a subtle change took place. Eyes grew more cautious. Pauses between sentences lengthened. Questions that once arose naturally were now held back, as if everyone understood that the moment was not right. Over time, silence began to generate a form of unspoken agreement. When everyone around remained quiet, each individual gained another reason to believe that their worry was personal, or at least not yet important. That belief encouraged further silence. A loop formed where silence reinforced silence, and fear found room to spread without requiring a single word. Evenings revealed this mechanism most clearly. When work was finished and there was nothing left to occupy attention, people became aware of the absence of the stories that once helped them connect, not because there was nothing to say, but because what needed to be said lay too close to the shared unease. They sat beside one another, listening to the wind and the familiar sounds of the place, yet each person seemed to be listening for something different, a sensation they did not know how to share. No one spoke of monsters. Language tied to images or the supernatural had not appeared and perhaps was not yet necessary. Instead, there were vague phrases broad enough for anyone to place their own feelings inside them. Something is not right, a strange feeling, an unusual year. These expressions allowed fear to exist without being framed, without being forced into confrontation. That vagueness was what made silence effective. Without a clear image, without a defined object, people did not know where to direct their fear. They turned toward one another not to seek answers, but to search for signals. Each person became a small mirror reflecting the shared state. If others remained silent, then silence must be the correct response. Gradually, silence ceased to be merely a reaction and became a guiding force. It determined what could be said and what must be withheld. It directed attention toward the small differences between people rather than toward the larger patterns slowly taking shape. In this space, fear did not need form or narrative. It required only the unspoken agreement that something was misaligned and that no one was yet willing to be the first to disrupt the fragile order. As silence persisted, it developed a voice of its own, not through sound, but through pressure. Pressure that made speech feel heavier, that turned questioning into a social risk. In such an atmosphere, unease no longer needed words to spread. It traveled through glances, through pauses, through the excessive attention given to details that should not have mattered. And when everyone remained silent, no one could be certain whether that quiet was protecting the community from panic or concealing something they themselves did not yet dare to name. The question was never spoken, but it lingered in the air like an echo without a source. When everyone is silent, who is speaking on their behalf? When the present becomes difficult to grasp, people tend to turn back toward what feels familiar, not to search for new answers, but to borrow a feeling that once existed. That is when old stories begin to resurface, not through invitation or command, but as a natural reflex of collective memory, responding to prolonged unease. These stories do not arrive as warnings. They are not told with urgency, nor are they meant to provoke fear. They surface gently, slipping into the spaces between familiar routines, as if they had always been there, waiting for a reason to be recalled. They are told in even tones, without emphasis, without dwelling on uncomfortable details. Their purpose is not to clarify, but to soothe. During long evenings, when there is nothing left to occupy attention, shared memory becomes a place of refuge. Someone recalls a distant time when things were harder than they are now. Someone else remembers periods when familiar order once wavered, yet eventually reformed in its own way. These memories are not shared for comparison, but to place the present within a longer current where unease is not an ending. What matters is that these stories are not meant to explain what is happening. They do not answer why things feel misaligned. Instead, they offer a different sensation, quieter and more comfortable. The sense that people have stood in similar moments before with the same uncertainty and continued. In that context, old belief does not function as a system of explanation, but as an anchor for the mind. Listening to these stories does not require absolute belief. It requires only recognition. Familiarity eases the pressure to understand immediately. It allows people to postpone the search for meaning and to focus instead on maintaining the fragile stability of daily life. In a world growing less predictable, that postponement is not weakness, but necessity. Those who tell the stories do not see themselves as keepers of truth. They offer no conclusions, ask for no agreement. They remember and repeat, as if remembering itself were sufficient. In this way of telling, there is no ambition to control fear, only the desire to keep it from exceeding what the community can endure. Because of this, no one asks for details. Clear images, if they appeared, would break the calming effect. What people need is not a complete picture, but a blurred pattern. The idea that incomprehensible periods have happened before and that not understanding does not equal collapse. The vagueness of the stories becomes an advantage, allowing each person to place their own measure of worry within them without pressure. In this role, tradition is not a threat. It does not speak of consequences or list mistakes to avoid. It works instead like a collective sedative, slowing thought, softening the questions that have begun to gather. When people listen to these stories, they do not feel that something terrible is about to happen. They feel that what is happening is not entirely outside human experience. Old beliefs also help reposition fear. Rather than viewing it as a sign of imminent danger, people begin to see it as a state that has been endured before, a condition the community has at certain times been forced to live through. This perspective does not remove fear, but it makes it less personal, less isolating. When fear is placed inside shared memory, it loses some of its immediate weight. These stories offer no solutions. They do not change living conditions, nor do they erase the sense of misalignment, but they create a valuable buffer between unease and action. Within that buffer, people can continue their routines, continue maintaining the familiar structures they depend on to survive. That buffer keeps the community from being pulled into hasty reactions, which might cause greater harm than the fear itself. Yet the calming effect carries its own limit. When people rely on stories to remain steady, their attention turns backward. The past becomes a measure for the present, and the belief that things will resemble earlier times provides another reason to wait. For a while, that waiting feels comforting. It allows endurance without confrontation with uncertainty. In this state, the community is no longer governed entirely by silence. Silence is now filled with memory and familiar narratives. No one feels alone before what they do not yet understand, but this sense of safety is temporary, built on the assumption that the present is merely a variation of the past rather than something that demands a new way of seeing. And while the stories continue to be told to keep the spirit from fracturing, the question remains quiet but persistent. When people rely on belief to endure unease, are they trying to understand the world, or merely trying to survive the discomfort of not understanding? At that moment, belief is born. To explain, or simply to help people endure one more day. The stories retold to preserve calm worked as intended at first. They softened the atmosphere and allowed people to continue their lives without being pulled into the spiral of unanswered questions. Over time, however, those same stories began to reveal something else subtler and more difficult to accept. Though everyone heard the same words, they no longer understood or used them in the same way. Belief, when it existed as shared memory, functioned as a gentle support. It did not require complete agreement, only presence. But when unease failed to recede, as expected, belief began to take on another role. It did not merely reassure, it began to guide. It helped people decide whether to wait longer or to prepare for something else. It was at this point that differences quietly emerged. The same story was told, yet each listener heard a different message within it. Some took it as proof that nothing needed to change. If things had once been harder and had passed, then the present would pass as well. For them, belief affirmed that patience was the correct choice. Waiting was not avoidance, but a way of living that had already proven itself. Others, hearing the same story, drew a different conclusion. They did not hear comfort, but a reminder. If earlier periods of hardship had required adjustment, then the present might demand something similar. For them, belief was not a reason to remain still, but a suggestion that it was time to pay closer attention and to prepare. This difference did not appear as open debate. No one stood to contradict another. It existed in reactions and small daily choices. Some continued as before, trusting that maintaining routine was the best way to protect the community. Others began to change habits quietly, as if preparing for a possibility they were not yet ready to name. At this stage, belief was no longer a neutral story. It began to serve a clear social function. It helped indicate who belonged to which way of seeing, even though no one named the division. People noticed that some thought as they did and some did not. That recognition did not cause immediate conflict, but it altered how people regarded one another. What mattered was that this difference did not arise from new events or new evidence. It was based entirely on the interpretation of the same familiar material. For that reason, each side felt reasonable. No one believed they were stepping outside the community. On the contrary, everyone believed they were acting for the common good, differing only in how that good was understood. Gradually, these differing interpretations became part of identity. No declarations were needed, no explicit choices made. People positioned themselves through how they spoke, how they fell silent, and how they reacted to small changes. These signals were enough for others to recognize, even though nothing was said aloud. A community once bound by shared habits now found itself divided by differing meanings drawn from the same story. The fracture was not loud. It did not break the visible structure of daily life. People still met, still worked together, still shared space. Yet a new distance appeared thin but difficult to cross. The distance of no longer being certain that the person opposite was seeing the world in the same way. In conversation, belief now functioned less as common ground and more as a marker. A single remark could be understood in multiple ways, and the response revealed more than what was spoken. People began to weigh their words more carefully, not only out of fear of causing unease, but out of fear of being placed within a particular interpretation. Silence once again became the safer choice. This division did not cause the community to collapse immediately, but it altered the foundation of cohesion. Before people believed they were facing the world together in the same way. Now that belief was uncertain. In its place grew the sense of standing beside one another, but no longer looking entirely in the same direction. Belief which had been meant to help endure now began to separate, not because it was false, but because it was being used for different purposes. For some, it justified continued waiting. For others, it served as a reminder that waiting itself had limits. These two interpretations existed side by side, not in confrontation, but enough to create invisible boundaries within shared life. The community in this state continued to exist in form. Yet unity once taken for granted became a question, when the same story no longer carried the same meaning, but held people together, shared memory, or merely habits that had not yet changed. And when belief ceased to be a point of connection and became a sign of difference, did the community still exist as a single body or only as individuals standing close together because they lacked a reason strong enough to move apart? The fracture in how the world was understood did not immediately produce clear lines of division. At first, it only shifted the direction of attention. When shared stories were no longer enough to keep everyone still, eyes moved away from the larger picture and settled on what was closer. Closest and easiest to see were the people living beside one another. Fear, which had previously spread like an indistinct atmosphere, now found a more concrete anchor. Not because new evidence appeared, but because people needed somewhere to place their unease. Small changes in others' behavior, once overlooked, began to register. Someone spoke less. Someone no longer took part fully in familiar routines. Someone reacted more slowly to the stories that once provided reassurance. These differences were not large enough to be called problems, but they were enough to draw attention. What mattered was that none of those being noticed had done anything wrong. They had broken no rules, caused no harm, challenged nothing openly. They were simply no longer the same as before, or no longer the same as the majority in that moment. And that difference within prolonged uncertainty became a signal open to interpretation. People did not say they were afraid of these individuals. Instead, they said something felt off, a discomfort in proximity, a vague intuition that caution was needed. These words carried no accusation, yet they were sufficient to alter the interaction. Distance was created not through speech, but through small adjustments in daily behavior. Someone was invited less often. Someone's opinion was no longer sought as before. Decisions once shared were now made without their presence. There were no announcements, no explanations. Everything unfolded as though it were a necessary reorganization, a natural way of keeping life from being disrupted. At this stage, fear was no longer a floating sensation. It began to attach itself to specific people, even without being named, not because they represented danger, but because they made visible the uncertainty the community was trying not to face directly. When the world grows unpredictable, anyone who sharpens that unpredictability becomes unsettling. The community did not view these acts of distancing as cruel. On the contrary, they were understood as precaution. When familiar order wavers, narrowing the circle of safety feels like a reasonable reflex, keeping what is familiar close and pushing what confuses farther away. This protection was not expressed in the language of fear, but in the language of responsibility. People spoke of the need for greater caution. It was not the time to take risks. The community had to think of the majority. These statements sounded sensible, even trustworthy. They did not target specific individuals yet. Through repetition, they slowly established a new standard for who was considered appropriate under the circumstances. Those pushed toward the margins did not always recognize it immediately. Isolation unfolded slowly enough to make them doubt their own perception. Perhaps they had changed without noticing. Perhaps they were being overly sensitive. No one told them they no longer belonged, but the accumulation of small signs created a chill that was difficult to deny. Meanwhile, those at the center of the community did not feel they were doing anything wrong. They believed they were acting for collective stability. When fear had no clear explanation, reducing sources of unease seemed necessary. No one believed they were creating division. They believed they were keeping things from slipping out of control. This shift altered how safety was understood, where safety once meant cohesion, and sharing it now began to mean sameness. The more alike, the lower the risk. The more different, the more scrutiny required. This was not a conscious decision, but the result of many small choices, each appearing reasonable at the moment it was made. Differences that had once been ordinary now carried a new weight. They became signs requiring explanation. And when no explanation was available, fear filled the gap, not with concrete scenarios, but with the sense that difference itself might become a problem if left unchecked. In its effort to protect itself, the community began to erect invisible boundaries. No one called it exclusion. The word was too heavy, too direct. Instead, lighter terms were used: appropriate, inappropriate, right time, not the right moment. These phrases allowed people to be pushed away without confronting the moral consequences directly. And so, for the first time, fear no longer existed only as a shared feeling. It stood before the community, taking the shape of particular people, not villains, not enemies, simply those who no longer fit perfectly into the image of safety that the community was trying to preserve. In that moment, removal was no longer seen as harm, but as a necessary measure to maintain this fragile order. Yet as safety began to be measured by who was pushed outside, a quiet question emerged, though no one was ready to speak it aloud. If protecting the community means narrowing it, where does safety end? And at what point did keeping oneself safe become inseparable from removing those no longer considered the same? Death did not arrive as a major event. It came without noise, without chaos, without provoking violent reactions. It arrived quietly, almost modestly, as if unwilling to claim too much attention. Because of that, in the first moment, many did not understand that something irreversible had just occurred. People only knew that someone did not wake up again. There had been no clear warning, no incident large enough to be remembered as a direct cause. The day before had unfolded like any other. Familiar routines had been carried out perhaps more slowly, more cautiously. And then, at a certain point, the absence became impossible to ignore. No one called it an accident. No one called it inevitable. Those words were too definite, too conclusive. Instead, there was a heavier silence than usual, a gap in the rhythm of life that no one knew how to fill. The death was not retold as a story because there was no coherent story to tell. What unsettled people was not the loss itself, but the lack of meaning. This death did not fit any pattern they recognized. It did not resemble punishment, nor did it appear as a clear, natural disaster. It was simply an abrupt ending, leaving behind no instructions for how it should be understood. In the days that followed, the community did not descend into panic. People continued doing what needed to be done with a more restrained focus. Work went on not because everything was fine, but because there was no alternative. This form of death did not halt life, but it changed how people moved within it. Questions arose almost immediately, yet none of them had a foundation. Why that person? Why now? Had some signs that were overlooked. Each question hovered without landing. There were no clear answers to end them, and no way to fully silence the need to ask. Notably, the community did not try to turn the death into a climax. No one used it to confirm that their fear had been justified, nor did anyone treat it as evidence of a specific threat. The death stood there bare and incomprehensible, serving no argument at all. That refusal to serve made it heavier. People began to look back at the days preceding it, not to assign blame, but to search for clues. Small details, once dismissed, returned with new attention, a period of fatigue that lasted longer than usual, an absence from a familiar activity. Yet, even when placed side by side, these details failed to form a clear picture. They only reinforced the sense that something had happened without anyone truly understanding it. This death did not immediately alter how people treated one another, but it deepened the distances that already existed. Those who had been noticed for their differences were now met with greater caution, not because they were considered the cause, but because their presence reminded the community of what could not be controlled. And in that moment, anything that recalled a loss of control became uncomfortable. Still, no one dared to speak that connection aloud. To assign the death to a particular person, even silently, felt like going too far. The community remained at the level of questioning without crossing into conclusion. That hesitation produced a state of quiet shock, not an explosive disbelief, but a sustained heaviness with no peak for release. Familiar rituals were carried out, though, with unusual care. People did what needed to be done, not because they believed it would provide answers, but because it was the only way they knew how to face death. These actions did not fully console, but they created a temporary frame that kept loss from spilling out of control. Afterward, life continued, though not exactly as before. No one said that everything had changed, but everyone sensed the difference. This death did not close a chapter. It opened a void. Within that void, unanswered questions began to gather quietly and persistently. What troubled the community most was not the possibility that death might return, but the fact that they did not know how to understand this one. There was no story strong enough to contain it, no belief clear enough to place it within familiar order. It existed as a single event, yet carried the feeling that the world had lost part of its ability to explain itself. And as people tried to return to familiar rhythms, the question followed them silently, needing no voice to persist. When confronted with death, what people seek is not only truth, but meaning. But if this death carried no meaning of its own, then perhaps the urge to assign cause revealed more about people than about death itself. Does death require a reason, or are people simply unable to endure the existence of an ending without explanation? After a death without explanation, the community could no longer remain suspended in a state made only of questions. Silence can stretch only so far, and once it passes that limit, it forces people to do the only thing that allows them to continue living, to seek understanding, not to resolve, but to endure. And so explanations began to appear slowly, yet decisively, as if each person already carried an answer waiting to be used. These explanations did not arrive at the same time, nor did they come from the same place. Some turned to familiar causes tied to the body and living conditions. Perhaps it was prolonged exhaustion, perhaps an illness that had gone unnoticed. These possibilities sounded reasonable, close enough to experience to avoid resistance. They offered the comfort that death, however painful, still lay within the bounds of human understanding. But such explanations did not hold for long. They were too broad, too easily applied to anyone at any time. They failed to explain why death had occurred in that way at that moment. And when they could not answer specific questions, they gradually lost their force. People did not reject them, but neither did they cling to them. Other explanations began to surface, more systematic in nature. Some looked to the environment, to small changes that had quietly accumulated. Perhaps living conditions had deteriorated unnoticed. Perhaps unseen factors had been acting on people steadily and over time. These explanations did not assign blame to individuals, but to circumstances. They felt more just, but also harder to grasp. Still, these understandings were not enough. They sketched a wider picture, but offered no anchor. They suggested that something was wrong, yet failed to point toward anything that could be changed immediately. Without concrete action attached, understanding became heavy, even anxiety-producing. To understand and be unable to act is a particularly uncomfortable form of helplessness. Alongside these practical explanations, Other ways of understanding quietly returned, not as assertions, but as suggestions. Some recalled the old stories once told to remain calm. Perhaps in some way, this death belonged to a sequence that had existed before, not as a threat, but as a reminder that the world does not always operate according to human expectation. These explanations never took precedence, yet they were never dismissed. They lingered at the edges, present enough to be mentioned, strong enough to unsettle. They offered no evidence, but they aligned with the feeling that something lay beyond familiar control. When other explanations proved insufficient, ambiguity acquired its own appeal. At this stage, the community reached no consensus. Each explanation drew a different group, but no group was large enough or convincing enough to prevail. There was no winning side, no official answer. Instead, there was a quiet competition in which explanations coexisted, overlapping without fully displacing one another. Notably, people did not choose explanations based on accuracy because no one possessed the means to measure it. They chose based on feeling. One understanding made fear easier to bear. Another created the sense of doing something, however small. Truth in this context was no longer something to be discovered, but something to be selected. That selection was never declared. No one stood to announce what was right and what was wrong. Yet through speech, through behavior, through what was attended to and what was ignored, choices became visible. Some spoke more of the body and living conditions. Others emphasized environment and accumulation. Some held on to old stories as a quiet frame of reference. No group believed itself to be inventing meaning. Each explanation had a reason to exist because each filled a different gap in human experience. But for that very reason, none was sufficient on its own. Each resolved part of the unease while simultaneously generating new questions it could not answer. The failure of intellect did not stem from a lack of intelligence, but from the absence of shared ground. When a community no longer shares a single way of understanding the world, reaching agreement becomes impossible. Intellect, once used to connect people around a common truth, now serves only to reinforce separate interpretations. In this state, death was no longer the sole sinner. It became the starting point for another process, one in which the search for meaning outweighed the search for truth. People needed a story they could live with, not merely a logically correct explanation. And when many stories coexist, truth begins to lose its authority. The community continued to function, but with a new awareness, though not yet named, that there is not always a single answer everyone can share. Within gaps of understanding, people must choose something to hold on to or risk being pulled down by uncertainty. And as explanations competed without any being enough, a quiet question formed, directed not outward toward the world, but inward toward people themselves. When they do not know what is right, what will they choose to believe, to act upon, to live by? And in that choice, are they seeking truth or simply a feeling solid enough to endure one more day? No moment could be pointed to as the one when life became different. No alarm sounded. No event is large enough to force everyone to stop and acknowledge a change. Instead, there was a sequence of small adjustments, regular and reasonable, so consistent that when looking back, it became difficult to say exactly when things were no longer the same as before. After explanations proved insufficient, the community did not choose to remain still, nor did it descend into chaos. What followed resembled an unspoken agreement that continuing to live mattered more than understanding completely. And to continue living the way of living had to change, not through large decisions, but through new rules that formed quietly. These rules were never written down. They existed in how people adjusted their behavior, who should remain close to whom when it was acceptable to go out, when it was better to stay in. These choices were not described as fear, but as caution, and caution repeated often enough quickly became standard. Life went on, but at a different rhythm. Familiar routines were preserved, yet wrapped in new layers of precaution. People spoke less about reasons and more about methods. not because answers had been found, but because answers were no longer the priority. What mattered was how to let a day pass without introducing additional risk. If panic existed, it did not erupt. It was compressed and evenly distributed throughout daily life. It appeared in checking more often than necessary, in avoiding unfamiliar situations, in repeating habits that provided a sense of control, however fragile. People did not shout or flee. They adjusted. At first, these changes were considered temporary, a phase to endure. But as days followed days without any clear signal to return to what had been the temporary began to extend. New rules created to cope gradually became a way of life. No one clearly remembered why they had been introduced. They only knew that acting differently created unease. Children learned these rules more quickly. For them, this was not a loss, but reality. They observed adults and imitated them. They did not ask why. They did not compare with what came before. That realization made adults understand that the change had gone deeper than expected. When a new generation accepts fear as an ordinary part of life, it ceases to be a reaction and becomes a foundation. In this state, the community functioned with a strange stability. There were no major disruptions, no heated disputes. People knew what to do and what to avoid. Differences still existed, but they were managed through distance. Everyone understood their boundaries and rarely crossed them. This shared understanding reduced conflict, but it also reduced contact. The new rules did more than regulate behavior. They reshaped thought. People began to censor their own questions, not because questions were forbidden, but because asking no longer brought clear benefit. Questions could lead to anxiety, and anxiety, when it did not lead to concrete action, only made life heavier. It felt better to follow what had already been accepted as safe. Fear in this form is no longer paralyzed. It became part of the rhythm of life, like weather or fatigue. People learned to live with it, adjusting expectations, narrowing desires. What was once considered normal now felt risky, and what had once felt risky, if no longer mentioned, slowly disappeared from shared imagination. What was striking was that people did not feel they were sacrificing anything significant. Each change was small. Each concession seemed reasonable. There was no moment strong enough to provoke resistance. It was the accumulation of these small steps that completed the transformation without requiring a single shock. This new life brought a certain sense of stability, fewer surprises, fewer collisions, fewer questions. For many, this felt like relief. Without the constant need to confront uncertainty, they could focus on what lay directly ahead. The stability was not joyful, but it was bearable. Yet within that stability, there was a difficult to name absence, not a clear sadness, but the loss of something that once existed, perhaps curiosity, perhaps trust, perhaps the sense that the world, even when dangerous, was still worth opening oneself to. The absence did not cause immediate pain, but it was there quietly. When fear becomes a habit of living, it is no longer recognized as fear. It blends into how people think, choose, and interact. No one says they are afraid. They say they are being realistic, more careful, more mature. These words are convincing enough that no deeper examination seems necessary. And in a community that functions smoothly through rules born of fear, the final question is no longer how to be safer. If it arises at all, it lies deeper and more unsettling. When fear has become normal, when it is no longer identified as an abnormal state, what has quietly disappeared from people, in exchange for that stability. After living under the new rules for a while, the community stopped asking where they came from. They were simply there, followed because they had proven one thing only, that life continued. Yet within that continuation, another feeling began to form, slower and harder to recognize than the original fear. The sense that following rules alone might no longer be enough. No one said this aloud. There were no meetings, no calls to action, but in brief conversations, in the pauses between sentences, a new pressure emerged. Not the pressure to understand, but the pressure to do something. What that something was, no one could yet say. But remaining still, once the safest option, now carried a quiet discomfort. This feeling did not resemble fear. It did not cause people to withdraw or avoid. It felt more like a vague impulse, a light but persistent tapping on awareness. Each day that passed without noticeable change made that tapping clearer, not because conditions were obviously worsening, but because prolonged immobility began to look like a sign of irresponsibility. No one accused anyone directly. No one was publicly criticized for doing nothing, but the way people looked at one another changed. When someone appeared too calm, too accepting of the current rhythm, it was no longer read as composure, but as indifference. And indifference in this context became a moral flaw, even if it was never named as such. This pressure spread without words. It appeared in indirect questions. Should we be even more careful? Is there something else we ought to change? These questions were not meant to find concrete solutions. They served another purpose to reveal who was prepared to act in some way and who was not. The difference between these positions began to register, even though no one drew clear lines. What mattered was that no one knew what the right action was. There was no new evidence, no new event strong enough to serve as a marker. The urge to act did not arise from reason, but from the accumulation of identical days of rules followed mechanically. When everything had already been adjusted to reduce risk, not adjusting further began to feel like a lack of initiative. Some people began to suggest small changes, not because they were certain these changes were necessary, but because suggesting them demonstrated that they were not standing still. These proposals were framed as preventive measures. They did not claim a specific danger, only that greater caution could not harm. This logic was difficult to oppose because it demanded no belief, only agreement. Those who hesitated did not do so out of opposition, but out of uncertainty about the benefit. Yet in the new atmosphere, asking for concrete benefits began to appear insensitive. When shared unease had not been resolved, demanding certainty seemed inappropriate. And so hesitation was gradually pushed to the margins, not through criticism, but through a sense of falling out of step. The community had not yet entered a phase of accusation. No one was declared wrong, but the standard was shifting. Before standing still had been the safe choice. Now standing still began to look like an unnecessary delay. The shift occurred slowly enough to avoid resistance, yet clearly enough for everyone to feel it. Moral pressure did not come from a new value system, but from a rearrangement of old values. Responsibility, once tied to preserving stability, began to align with initiative. Care, once expressed through restraint, was now measured by willingness to act. No one announced this change, but everyone adjusted how they evaluated one another. Those who acted even minimally and cautiously were regarded differently, not as correct, but as well-intentioned. And in a community searching for proof that it was not powerless, good intentions became a valuable trait. In contrast, doing nothing, even for understandable reasons, began to carry a shadow that was difficult to remove. The danger of this stage lay not in action itself, but in the sense that action was required before understanding had fully formed. When the need to do something arises before clarity exists, action becomes an end in itself. It no longer serves to address a problem, but to relieve the psychological pressure building within the community. At some point difficult to locate precisely, the community crossed a threshold with no return, not because something irreversible had been done, but because the meaning of inaction had changed. What was once a reasonable choice became a sign of potential error. And once inaction was seen as wrong, any action, even untested, gained the possibility of acceptance. People continued to say that no conclusions had been reached, that no one had been blamed, that no one had been forced, but the shared feeling was no longer the same, remaining where one had lost its neutrality. It now carried a light but persistent moral weight, enough to make people doubt their own choices. And as life continued within a stability built from fear and habit, a quiet question emerged, not aimed at any single action, but at this moment itself. When did doing nothing, Once a way to protect the community begin to look like a mistake, and when standing still becomes suspect, how much farther can a community go without knowing where to stop? It was not fear that exhausted the community, but prolonged hesitation. After too many days spent living with the sense that something had to be done, without knowing where to begin, people started searching for whatever could end this suspended state. They did not need the complete truth. They needed something solid enough to lean on to decide. And when truth did not present itself, they began to create something that could stand in its place. Signs that had once been scattered were now gathered together, not to understand them, but to arrange them. A sequence of events was placed side by side in a way that made them appear connected. Small details that had been ignored or debated were repeated with a different tone, no longer as questions, but as mutual confirmation that they were not random. No one claimed this was evidence in the strict sense. That word was too heavy, too demanding of verification and challenge. Instead, lighter terms were used: indicators, patterns, notable coincidences. These concepts did not require absolute precision. They only needed to sound reasonable enough to avoid immediate dismissal. And in a moment when everyone wanted an end to hesitation, that was enough. Evidence in this form was not created to convince skeptics. It was created to reinforce those already prepared to agree. Repeated often enough, these signs began to generate a sense of certainty, even though no one could point to a single undeniable core. That certainty did not come from logic, but from consensus. Belief, which had previously existed in fragments across individuals and small groups, was now arranged into a system. Earlier interpretations were filtered, retaining only those elements that aligned with the direction of action taking shape. What did not fit was pushed aside, not through argument, but through silence. When an explanation was no longer mentioned, it slowly lost its right to exist. This process required no visible center of authority. It unfolded through imitation, a phrase repeated, an argument reused in different contexts, a connection treated as self-evident, requiring no further explanation. Gradually, a new structure of belief emerged, unwritten, yet clear enough that everyone understood which way of thinking was acceptable. At the same time, morality began to shift. Where avoiding premature conclusions had once been considered prudent, that caution now started to look like an obstacle. In a context where there were said to be enough signs, continued doubt appeared unnecessary, not because doubt was wrong, but because it slowed collective movement. Old values did not disappear. They were rearranged. Responsibility was no longer tied to remaining neutral, but to standing with what was considered necessary. Care was no longer expressed through restraint, but through willingness to accept stronger measures. Morality at this stage was defined not by principle, but by the outcome people hoped to achieve. Notably, no one felt they were distorting the truth. Each person believed they were simply emphasizing what mattered. And when many people emphasized the same direction, that direction began to feel obvious. Critical questions did not vanish entirely, but they grew out of place. Asking questions was no longer seen as seeking truth, but as obstructing progress. The evidence being created did not need to withstand rigorous testing because its purpose was not to prove, but to permit action, to permit crossing the threshold of hesitation, to permit the community to believe that there was no longer any other option but to move forward. In such a state, asking for more time to verify began to appear irresponsible. Collective resolve did not arise from anger, but from relief. Relief that there was finally a direction. Relief that life no longer had to be lived suspended between understanding and not understanding. This resolve carried a calm, almost reasonable appearance. No one shouted, no one forced. People simply adjusted themselves little by little to a new standard. Those who agreed early did not see themselves as leaders. They believed they were simply being realistic. Those who still hesitated were not immediately excluded, but they began to feel out of rhythm. No one demanded their agreement, Yet everything around them started to operate as if agreement were already assumed. At this point, the community had not yet carried out any extreme action, but something more important had already occurred. The moral framework had been redefined. What was once unacceptable had been moved into a gray zone. And when that gray zone expands far enough, action no longer requires the same level of justification as before. The decision, though never announced, had begun to take shape. It lived in how people spoke to one another, in how they avoided old questions, in how they cited new signs as though they had long been established. This consensus had no clear moment of birth. It accumulated, layered upon itself, until opposing it became harder than remaining silent. And while the community believed it was moving toward action based on evidence, another question quietly emerged, not about the content of the decision, but about how it had been formed. Who was the first to nod when no one yet had to? And who was the last to remain silent, even though they had never fully agreed? Action did not erupt. It did not arrive in anger or raised voices. It came like a procedure completed after all conditions had been arranged for long enough. When the framework of belief had stabilized, when morality had been redefined, doing what had once been hesitated over became far simpler. No further urging was required. It only had to be carried out. No one called this punishment. No one called it a sacrifice. Those words were too heavy, too likely to evoke cruelty. Instead, people spoke of survival, of necessity, of protecting what remained. These concepts carried no emotion, only reason, and it was this reasonableness that allowed the action to proceed in an orderly way. Everything was prepared carefully, but not in secrecy. Those who needed to know did. Those who did not ask. There was no large gathering, no shared declaration. An agreement had already existed, formed over many days and weeks through repeated phrases and avoided glances. When the moment of action arrived, no one was surprised. Those involved did not see themselves as decision makers. They were merely carrying out what had already been deemed necessary. Responsibility as understood then was no longer tied to asking questions, but to preventing the community from falling into danger. And if danger had been defined in a certain way, the accompanying action appeared self-evident. There was no sudden violence, no fierce resistance. What took place resembled a final reordering. Each step was taken with cold caution, as if everyone understood that emotion would only complicate what needed to be done. No voices were raised. No one hurried. Calm settled over the entire process. What was terrifying lay not in the specific act, but in the sense that it was the only remaining option. When all other paths had been closed by constructed belief and manufactured evidence, this action was no longer seen as a choice, but as an inevitable outcome. In that context, no one saw themselves as cruel. They saw themselves as preventing something worse. Those affected by the action were not named in ways that suggested individuality. They were referred to as something to be addressed, a risk to be removed. Language played a crucial role. When people were no longer spoken of as people treating them differently, became easier, not because anyone intended evil, but because the act of naming had shifted. Throughout the process, no one felt alone. Each person knew others were doing their part as well. This sharing of responsibility reduced individual moral weight. When everyone agreed, no one had to face consequences alone. Paradoxically, collective safety reached its peak at this very moment. This was the peak of fear, but not panicked fear. This was fear that had been domesticated, transformed into procedure. It did not tremble or shout. It functioned. It carried out what was considered necessary to ensure the community could continue to exist in the form it had defined. In that functioning fear reached its most refined state, there was no celebration after everything was finished, nor was there clear relief, only a hollow, cold emptiness that spread slowly. People returned to their routines, but the rhythm had changed. Something had occurred that could not be fully reversed, even if no one spoke of it. The rules, once created to prevent action, had now led directly to action. The circle closed. No one could claim they did not know this might happen, yet no one felt they were the ones who caused it. Responsibility had been dispersed to the point of losing a center. Each person carried only a very small part, light enough not to feel heavy, but together impossible for anyone to bear. Afterward, the community continued to exist. It may even have appeared more stable in the short term, but that stability carried an invisible cost. A boundary had been crossed, though never marked. From that point on, things once unthinkable had become precedent. And precedent once established does not require reasons as strong as it did the first time. In the silence that followed the action, no one asked questions aloud, not because there were none, but because no one knew whom to ask. When everyone had agreed, when action had been taken in the name of survival, the boundary of responsibility blurred, and the only question that remained quiet yet persistent was not directed at what had been done, but at the community itself. If everyone agreed, who then is responsible? After the action took place, no moment could be called an ending. There was no sign to indicate that a phase had closed. Things simply continued, but with a different weight. As if the community had crossed a threshold, without turning back, not out of fear, but because no one knew how to name what had occurred. Life returned to its ordinary rhythm faster than many expected. Familiar routines resumed. Old rules remained. New rules stayed in place. There was no celebration, no visible relief. Whatever calm existed felt incomplete, insufficient to be called peace. What remained most noticeable was silence. Not the tense silence from before, when fear still hovered without shape. The silence was heavier. It did not wait for answers. It did not anticipate what came next. It simply settled over daily life, persistent and unremarked. No one explained what had been done. Not because it was believed to be wrong, but because the explanation no longer seemed necessary. The action had been carried out with enough shared agreement that revisiting it felt unnecessary. Speaking of it again risked reopening questions that no longer had a place. Silence became a way to keep the surface intact. Specific details were avoided, not because they were forbidden, but because they were uncomfortable. They led nowhere. They did not change the present. They offered no resolution. They only exposed a gap between what had happened and what was now being lived. This silence differed from the silence before the action. Earlier silence allowed fear to spread. Now silence absorbed consequence. It did not provoke imagination. It dulled it. Thoughts slowed, as if the mind had learned which areas were no longer safe to enter. The community did not collapse after what occurred. In the short term, it functioned more smoothly. Latent tensions flattened. Questions that once divided people no longer surfaced. This stability felt effective, as though something had been resolved, even if no one could say what that was. Within that stability, something was missing. Not a clear loss, but a gradual thinning of something that had once existed between people. Perhaps the assumption that everything could be spoken. Perhaps the belief that some boundaries should not be crossed. It did not disappear suddenly. It withdrew, leaving a space that was never acknowledged. Those who participated in the action were not visibly haunted. They did not show obvious remorse. They continued working, interacting, living. Yet in the way certain topics were avoided and how questions stopped before reaching their end, it was clear that some things had been set aside and would not be returned to. Those who did not participate also remained silent, not because they fully agreed, but because speaking now offered nothing but isolation. After the action, the community had little tolerance for voices that might disturb its fragile equilibrium. Silence became structural, not merely the absence of speech, but an unspoken agreement about what would not be reopened. No one enforced it. Everyone sensed it. Boundaries existed without being drawn. Time passed. Days followed without major disruption. This reinforced the sense that the matter had been settled, but that sense depended on not looking closely, not asking too precisely. Any attempt to name what had happened risked breaking the surface that kept things functional. The community continued carrying a compressed layer of memory beneath it. That memory was not told. It was not recalled in ordinary ways. It remained buried shallow enough to persist, but deep enough to avoid accidental contact. The emptiness that followed did not announce itself as pain. It did not demand attention. It remained steady, a sense that something had closed without final words. And within this new silence, the question no longer pointed outward. It turned inward. When no one speaks anymore, it is not because there is nothing left to say, but because something has been buried, so life can go on. And whatever lies beneath that silence remains there, waiting for another moment to be remembered. Peace did not arrive all at once. It came in small increments, slowly enough to avoid suspicion. At first, it was only the sense that days felt lighter, less tension, fewer questions. No one declared that everything was fine, yet everyone sensed that something had softened. And within that softening, people began to search for an explanation. Not everyone needed the same explanation, but everyone needed a cause. Without a cause, peace felt fragile, easily disrupted by memories that had never been named. And so the community began to assign meaning to its present calm, not through debate, but through simple phrases repeated often enough to settle in place. People said that the recent measures had worked, that decisiveness had been necessary, that without action things might have become worse. These statements were not verified, but neither were they questioned. They fit the relief spreading through daily life, and that was sufficient. When an explanation allows people to breathe more easily, few feel the need to look deeper. Gradually, what had occurred was retold as a lesson, not a concrete lesson with clear details, but a moral outline. There are moments when difficult choices must be made. That survival requires sacrifice. That a community can continue only when it is willing to do what must be done. These lessons were not meant to be debated, but to reinforce the sense that the present was the correct outcome. Notably, these stories avoided detail. No one wanted to revisit each step that had led to the action. Those details did not serve the calm that now existed. On the contrary, they threatened to disturb it. Memory was therefore softened selectively. Conclusions were retained. The path leading to them was allowed to fade. In conversation, the recent past was referred to in general terms. What happened before a difficult period? A moment that required firmness. These expressions were enough to signal understanding, but not enough to reopen feeling. They created a safe distance between the present and what had occurred, allowing people to look back without facing it directly. This peace was defensive in nature. It was not full happiness, but relief from prolonged strain. People protected this feeling by avoiding questions that might unsettle it, not because they feared truth, but because they feared losing the stability they had only just reached. At this stage, the community appeared more unified, not because people shared more, but because they avoided differences that caused discomfort. Shared stories smoothed rough edges. When everyone agreed on the meaning of peace, there was no need to confront deeper disagreement. Those who had once hesitated before the action gradually accepted the new interpretation as well, not because they were fully convinced, but because continued doubt offered no clear benefit. The present calm was real, at least in daily experience. And in life, experience often carries more weight than unanswered questions. Over time, the story of what had happened became more compact. It was retold in ways that were easy to remember, easy to pass on, and easy to accept. Darker aspects did not disappear, but they were pushed outside the shared frame. No one actively concealed them, but no one actively retrieved them either. This forgetting was not entirely unconscious. It was a collective choice, though never acknowledged as such. Peace came to be interpreted as reverse proof. If the present was stable, then what had been done must have been right. This reasoning required no strict logic. It only needed to align with feeling. And as relief spread, it grew strong enough to stand without reinforcement. In this state, the community continued to live, to work to rebuild its routines. New rules became familiar. New limits were accepted as part of reality. Peace, however fragile, was protected by stories sufficient to keep it from collapsing. Yet, because this peace depended on constant interpretation in order to survive, it carried a weakness within it. It relied on not looking back too closely, not questioning too deeply. Any change in how the story was told, any detail recalled differently, had the potential to unsettle the emotional ground beneath it. And while the community believed it had found a way to go on, a quiet question remained. It did not break the calm, but it did not disappear. Among the beliefs selected to keep life moving forward, which belief truly allows people to live on, even if it may not be entirely true, not everyone returned to the previous rhythm, even though on the surface everything appeared stable. Some people disappeared in ways that drew little attention. There were no farewells, no events that demanded explanation. They simply stopped being present in familiar circles of daily life. At first, their absence was understood as temporary. Anyone might need to withdraw for a while, but time passed, and some empty spaces were never filled. Those who did not return were not always gone in a physical sense. Some still lived there, still worked, still appeared when required. Yet they had withdrawn from the spaces that once bound the community together. They spoke less, participated less. Their gaze no longer searched for affirmation from those around them. Their presence became formal, as if they were fulfilling an obligation rather than sharing a life. No one called this a consequence. That word sounded too severe, too close to diagnosis. Instead, people said that some had not yet adjusted, that some needed time, that some had changed. These phrases were soft enough to spare the community from facing the reality that not everyone had been healed by the new peace. Psychological residue did not appear as visible breakdowns. It showed itself in small reflexes. Some avoided certain topics without thinking. Others grew tense when routines were disturbed even slightly. Some reacted too strongly to vague signs of instability, as if they had learned to keep everything within control, no matter how minor the threat. The community was not entirely unaware of this, but it learned to live alongside it, like a crack in a wall, not large enough to collapse the structure, but large enough to signal that strain had once passed through here. No one tried to repair the crack. They avoided looking at it too long. As long as it did not spread, as long as it posed no immediate danger, letting it remain was considered acceptable. Those who did not return were often the quietest about what had happened, not because they had forgotten, but because memory no longer required words to persist. It had settled into how they perceived the world. Within their silence existed a different kind of understanding difficult to share and difficult to receive within a community determined to preserve calm. There were rare moments when an offhand remark brushed against shared memory. When that happened, the response was not argument or denial, but discomfort. Conversation shifted quickly, as if there were an unspoken rule against going further. No one forbade it, but everyone understood that nothing good would come of it. The disappearance of some from shared life was never marked as an official loss. There were no rituals, no collective expressions of regret. This made their absence harder to grasp. It went unmarked and therefore unremembered. Yet, because of that, it endured more persistently, like a gap without a name. Over time, the community adjusted to these gaps. Roles were redistributed. New relationships formed. Life found a different balance. Functionally, things continued to operate, but they did so on altered ground, not because anything supernatural remained, but because shared experience had left an imprint on collective psychology. Those who did not return became, in a way, reflections of what the community did not wish to confront. They carried proof that not everything could be reorganized through story or rule. Their existence, however muted, reminded us that some consequences cannot be fully absorbed into ordinary life. No one forced them to return. No one blamed them for withdrawing. That respect was real, but it carried distance. Those who remained did not know what to do with that difference. They chose to leave it untouched as part of the new reality, living alongside it without contact. With time, these residues became part of an unofficial history. They were not taught as lessons. They were not used as warnings. They lived in small habits, in how the community reacted to instability, in its caution when facing difficult choices. No one named them, yet everyone was shaped by them. The peace achieved earlier remained, but it was no longer whole. It carried a faint echo, like aftershocks, following a past event, not strong enough to break things apart, but strong enough to remind that present stability was built on what had been lost, even if that loss was never acknowledged. And while the community continued to live to repeat the stories that allowed it to go on, those who did not return remained in their own way. They were part of this place even if they no longer merged with it. Their absence created no strange phenomena, no trace of the supernatural. Yet it endured persistent and unresolved, a reminder that some things can vanish from view, but never truly leave. Truth did not arrive as a verdict. It came late, quietly, almost modestly, like a final explanation placed on the table, after all major decisions had already been made. There was no relief, no sense of redemption, only a slow recognition that what had once been impossible to understand could now be named. The new information did not appear as a major discovery. It came as small fragments, concrete enough to stand on their own, clear enough to no longer be dismissed as speculation. The causes identified were not metaphysical or mysterious. They belonged to the body, to living conditions, to factors that had accumulated silently over time. There was no malicious intent, no opposing force, only a complex interaction between people and the environment they live within. Science in this moment did not arrive as a savior. It brought no promise that everything would be fine. It offered only a different way of understanding, colder and more precise. Phenomena once attributed to collective fear were now placed within traceable chains of cause, not to undo what had happened, but to explain why it had happened. What caused pain was not that the truth was unacceptable, but that it arrived too late to change anything. Actions taken could not be reversed. Decisions had crossed a point of no return. Truth did not collapse the present, but it unsettled how the past was now seen. No one stepped forward to confess. No one was singled out for blame. What had occurred was not the result of one individual, but of a series of reasonable choices made in separate moments. Seen under a new light, each choice could still be understood, but stacked together, they produced an outcome no one had wanted, and no one could fully deny their part in. This truth did not accuse, but it also did not allow innocence. Each person recognized that they had contributed, however slightly, to something irreversible, not through malice, but through compliance, through silence when silence was easiest, through agreement when agreement was required, no effort was made. That recognition did not explode into dramatic remorse. It settled instead heavy and enduring. The community responded to the truth with a silence different from before. No longer the silence of concealment or protection. This was the silence of knowing and being unable to act further. Conversations, if they happened at all, were cautious. No one wanted to use this truth to reopen everything. Not because it was denied, but because there was no action left that could meaningfully respond to it. Science explained, but it did not console. It did not close the gaps that had formed, and nor did it bring back those who never returned. It simply cast a cold light over decisions once made in the darkness of fear. That light did not destroy the community, but it revealed fractures that had been there all along. Some found in this truth a delayed sense of relief, not because responsibility was lifted, but because complete uncertainty was finally gone. Yet that relief quickly gave way to a more uncomfortable question. If understanding had been possible in this way, could things have been different had it arrived earlier? No one answered that question, not because it lacked importance, but because it led nowhere. Time could not be reversed. Choices had become history. Truth in this role was no longer a tool for change, but a burden of awareness the community had to learn to carry. Stories once told to maintain calm no longer stood as firmly. They did not collapse, but they lost certainty. The new truth did not refute them. It revealed that they had been using temporary ways of enduring. Recognizing this did not weaken people, but it forced them to face their own capacity for self-deception. The community did not fall apart in the face of truth. Life continued. Systems held. What remained was a subtle shift in how people understood themselves. The belief that everything possible had been done was gone. In its place was a painful humility about the limits of human understanding when guided by fear. Truth, when it arrives late, does not deliver complete justice. It does not correct, punish, or redeem. It simply exists a reminder that understanding does not always come in time, and that decisions made in darkness leave traces, even after light appears. And as the community tried to place this truth somewhere, it could be endured, a final question continued to echo, not to seek an answer, but to test the value of knowing itself. When truth emerges after everything is already too late, is knowing it truly a good thing, or merely another way people must live on with pain that cannot be undone? After everything, there is nothing new left to uncover. No secret is revealed. No final truth rises to demand belief. What remains does not reside in events, nor in explanations. It resides in the way people have moved through everything and in what they have been willing to accept to keep living. What is frightening is not the fear that once existed. Fear, whether vague or specific, can always be recognized. It is uncomfortable, but it is honest. It says that people are facing something they do not yet understand. What is more frightening is the human capacity to adapt to fear until it is no longer named. When fear blends into habit, it is no longer questioned. It becomes the foundation for choices that are considered normal. No one in this story is evil in any simple sense. There is no villain to condemn, no single act that can carry all responsibility. Every step had its reason. Every choice was made within a context that made it seem reasonable. It is precisely this sequence of reasonable decisions that produces something no one intended, yet everyone helped create. This does not allow for easy forgiveness, not because punishment is required, but because forgiveness too quickly offered would soften a more important question, the question of how people convince themselves that there is no other choice. When everyone believes they are only doing what is necessary, the boundary of personal responsibility becomes dangerously blurred. What is truly frightening is that no one feels they have chosen. Everything unfolds like a chain of natural reactions, as if decisions were made somewhere outside individual will. But there is no invisible hand directing it all. There are only people, one by one, agreeing to take one more small step in the direction that feels easier in the short term. This story does not end with complete awakening. There is no moment when the community stops and says they were wrong. There is also no declaration that they were right. Truth arrives too late to reorder everything into a new moral structure. It leaves only a pause, a space, in which people must live with what they have done without a perfect framework to justify it. Within that pause, what is frightening is not the memory of the act, but the possibility of repetition. Not because people learned nothing, but because what they learned is incomplete. They learned that stability can be achieved by narrowing the world. They learned that agreement reduces the feeling of guilt. They learned that when everyone acts together, no one has to stand alone with responsibility. These lessons are not taught deliberately. They seep into the way a community responds to unease, to difference, to unanswered questions. They become reflexes ready to be activated when similar conditions arise again. And this does not require a great catastrophe. It requires only enough ambiguity, enough fear, enough exhaustion from not knowing. The story closes not in the past, but in the present, because what is described does not belong to a distant time nor to a specific place. It belongs to how people in general confront uncertainty. How do they search for order? How they prioritize the feeling of safety over the incomplete truth. No direct warning is offered. Because warnings create a safe distance between the listener and the story. They allow people to believe that this will not happen to them. But what is truly frightening is not the possibility of occurrence, but how easily it can occur without anyone intending harm. Looking back at the whole, it becomes clear that the greatest danger is not a lack of knowledge, but confidence built on the fragile foundation of agreement. When enough people believe in the same interpretation, that interpretation becomes stronger than the truth. And when truth arrives late, it lacks the force to undo what has already been reinforced through action. This story does not ask the listener to choose a side. It offers no concrete advice. It creates only a space for reflection where questions are not fully resolved. Perhaps what matters is not finding the correct answer, but recognizing how vulnerable human judgment becomes when guided by shared fear. What is truly frightening is not what people have done, but what they may do again. The same sense of reason, the same calmness, the same belief that they are acting for something better. There is no monster in this story. There are only people with a deep need to keep living, even when the cost is only recognized once it is too late. And when the story ends here, it offers no comfort. It leaves a question that turns back toward the one listening not as an accusation, but as an honest test. If you lived in those circumstances with the same fragmented information, the same pressure, the same fear spreading slowly, are you certain that you would act differently?